Alright, hey guys, today for the final episode of this series for now, I may eventually end up making a video on deck building for BGs, but for the final of this series, we're going to be talking about defenders now. And for this video, it's going to be structured by the tiers again, because in my opinion, the class relationships in Battlegrounds do not matter all that much for defense. They matter for some specific classes, but what's most important is just what the specific defenders are more than the class relationships a lot of the time for these defenders. Because the classes that counter these defenders on attack oftentimes are not the classes with class advantage. A large amount of the time. There are specific scenarios where this isn't the case, like for Cosmic and a lot of the science defenders, they are directly countered by the skill and Mystic and stuff. But for the vast majority, the class relationships don't matter so much in terms of defense for VGs. So, yeah. And for these columns, it's going to be kind of similar to what I mentioned in the first video, except for this highly recommended defenders, it's kind of just going to be choosing the best of these rather than choosing the ones that fill the holes in your roster, because, defenders in BGs is a lot more about just strictly what is going to be the best, what is going to stop the most attackers, rather than trying to fill holes in your defense, because, there isn't exactly a way of doing that, with the exception of wanting to be able to have enough defenders that stop specific attackers so that you don't have to worry about banning attackers. There is, definitely a hint of that, but in general, most of the BG's defender strategies is going for the ones that are specifically better than other defenders in BGs and all. So yeah, let's get into it. I'll be going column by column again, like I said. So to start off in the must-have defenders, for the skill defenders that I believe are must-haves, first off, Nick Fury. This is self-explanatory. He is probably the single best defender in BGs. He is just an absolute monster. He definitely doesn't need Sig 200 for defense. I listed that there. It's mostly for the bigger HP, where you really notice the Sig 200 helping a lot. And I listed him as better in lower HP. This is mostly due to the fact of just how much stronger he was than the other options you have during the higher HP metas. During the higher HP metas, it was more 50-50 of whether you want to use him on defense or on attack. Whereas with the lower HP metas, it tends to be a lot more clear-cut, with you almost always want to use him on defense. He is just an absolute monster with lower health pools, because he's barely affected by it in terms of the speed he's getting taken down, Of course, like Sunspot and a few others are quicker, but generally all of the counters in Nick Fury are taking the same speed in these lower HP metas. And yeah, so the reason why he's so strong in defense is really just because of the second life. It just slows down a fight so much. So even if you do have a direct counter to Nick Fury, chances are it's not going to be that fast. To the point where you can basically automatically win rounds if you get a Nick Fury, because even the best counters to Nick Fury, with good RNG and everything, struggle to get past, like, a 38-second kill. Like, Sunspot, the fastest kill I've seen with Sunspot, who is probably the single best and most reliable counter to him, is 38 seconds, and especially in the lower HP metas, that's really not that quick. And Sunspot is absolutely one of the best attackers. So, having a chance to win against a Sunspot or something in a round is just very, very powerful. And there's really no quick counters to Nick Fury. And yeah, he's just an absolute force on defense. One of the best defenders in BG's, period. Every single meta, he's going to be dominant. There are specific metas where he's going to, specifically get stronger. Bubble Shield is a really good one for him with Bubble Shield, because his L1 just has so many block hits. So on top of having the slow fights, you're probably going to take a whole lot of chip damage as well, which is insane, of course. And because, a lot of the strategy in Nick Fury's second life involves blocking hits, so any of the metas that disincentivize blocking hits, he's going to do really, really well on. So, yeah, next up is Korg. Now, the reason Korg has the Suicides tag is because Suicides just boosts the block damage you're going to be taking when you're fighting him so much. And the Poison debuff is likely to get shrugged. And that block damage very heavily outweighs the slight time boost when you're fighting Korg. Because that block damage is just huge. Unless you've got someone who has a really, really direct counter to Korg, chances are they're going to be taking a fuck ton of block damage against him. And that block damage is just so huge that it definitely outweighs the damage Korg is going to be taking from Suicides. And yeah, it's really nice. And yeah, if you have a higher Sig Korg, it's definitely nice. He's still definitely worth putting in almost any deck at Sig 20. He's a very strong defender, regardless. And he definitely shines a lot more in the lower HP metas because, taking down the Rock Shield is just such a significant portion of the duration of the fight. And yeah. And he definitely counters the vast majority of the meta attackers that are dominant in these lower HP metas. Now, as for Korg, he really does just counter the vast majority of the nukes in Battlegrounds, which is the main thing that really helps him. He counters Tigra, he counters Hitmonkey, he counters CGR. To an extent, CGR can still have decent fights against him in BGs, but they're not going to be super quick or anything. He counters, Shang-Chi, he counters Nick Fury, he counters, almost all of the skill nuke options, and skill nukes are definitely some of the strongest nukes in the game, so getting rid of just all of that is massive. And he counters a lot of the cosmic nukes as well, or at minimum makes them take a lot longer, like, Surfer, CGR, and Hercules. They can still get decent fights against Korg, but it's just nowhere near. And then he counters Sunspot as well. So having just the counter to so many of these super strong attackers is just so massive for Korg. Because just removing those as options, because what commonly happens is a lot of people are just for drafting attack, if you're drafting attackers early in a round, a lot of the time you're just picking generic nukes. So countering almost all the generic nukes often means someone's going to have to pick a specific counter for Korg, or either that, or someone is going to end up having to someone is going to end up having to pick a specific counter. And oftentimes, if you have to pick a specific counter for this Korg, and you've already picked your attackers, maybe you've got too many attackers now, and you don't have enough for strong defenders, or maybe you have to pass up on something to pick that specific counter for Korg. Or oftentimes, if you pick Korg late in a round, they just won't get a good counter to him, and he's going to automatically win you a round, and he's just so massive. If you can get a smart draft around him, or if your opponent just gets unlucky, he's just such a dominant defender in BGs. Now, for Elsa, she absolutely needs Suicides to do anything in BGs. Now, for any of the metas where, there's like Masochism where it removes the bleed debuff from Suites, obviously she's going to be worthless in BGs, and for Elsa, her worth on defense is fairly clear-cut. If your opponent doesn't draft a mutant attacker against a Sui's Elsa, she's basically going to automatically win you around. There are some ways around it, like Nick Fury, I've done that cheese, but in general, that's the way. And the reason why this is so specifically dominant is because the vast majority of the mutant attackers are not super common in decks, and then some of the strongest ones, like Omega and Kitty Pryde, take an extreme amount of skill, to the point where a lot of people leave them out of their decks as attackers, and leaving out two of the best mutant attackers commonly is pretty massive for her. And yeah, worst comes to worst, you have to force out your opponent's Archangel or Sunspot, and then they just don't get Archangel or Sunspot for a future round. But oftentimes she can automatically win you a round, or another thing that can happen is force your opponent to use one of their strong mutant defenders against this Elsa. And then you don't have to deal with their mutant defender on defense, like, say, a Bishop or a Domino. they get that bishop or domino, and you just force them to use it for the Elsa, or they automatically lose the round. Or they can, just lose that, or, they lose that round, and then you have to deal with that, but then you have some freedom, because you've already won a round. And, having Elsa just force so much in drafts is just extremely powerful. Now, for science defenders in general, the main thing you want to avoid is catering to the vast majority of the skill nukes. Because there are a lot of skill nukes that can completely take any of the science defenders in BGs. Because the skill nuke class is just very, very strong. And Thing counters the vast majority of these skill options. The three strongest options for Thing in BGs tend to be Hitmonkey, Crossbones, and Falcon. These are just super dominant against him in BGs. But these aren't exactly the most common of attackers, specifically Crossbones and Falcon. Hitmonkey is super common, but Crossbones and Falcon are not exactly common picks. They're in a fair amount of people's decks, but they're definitely not auto picks. So, again, he kind of has the effect like Korg, where you're forced into specifically picking a counter to him. And there are just so few counters to Thing that are really quick. There's a lot of counters that can deal with him, but there's so few counters that are actually quick against Thing. So having that, just very, very powerful, similar to Korg. He definitely doesn't need Sig 200 in BGs, but it's very helpful. Sig 20 is still going to be pretty massive, but yeah. And yeah, Thing is just crazy powerful in BG's defense, especially in the lower HP metas. In the bigger HP metas, you definitely get expanded to a lot of other options that can take him. Like in the bigger HP metas, Mr. Negative and OG Black Panther and Diablo are very effective options against him. Oh, and there's also Tigra and Omega Red who are very effective options against Thing, but Tigra and Omega Red tend to be fairly uncommon in terms of, good Tigra and good Omega players aren't the most common things in the world, so a lot of the time you can not have to worry about those too much. But yeah, absolute monster on defense. Now, let's get to SPX. For SPX on defense, her glancing, for all basic attacks, she can glance a vast majority of basic attacks, turning off abilities and everything, counters a lot of the best attackers. It just completely destroys so many of the best attackers. Like CGR and Hercules struggled with getting their ramp up a lot against SPX. SPX is also amazing at forcing like an RNG fight for Torch, because Torch is actually pretty slow against SPX, even with the energy hits, just because of that glancing. It's a very, very powerful ability to have that glancing. Now, with SPX, she is definitely weak to champions who get the vast majority of their damage from special attacks and don't really have to worry about using basic attacks to ramp. Because, a lot of these champions will just completely destroy her with her small health pool especially. But, she can just have her glancing stretch out a fight so long. And the other thing is, her special 1 animation is fairly slow. So that can also force a little bit of stretching in a fight, especially when fights are already going long, so you likely have to bait more specials. And you really don't want to be baiting her special 2s, which, again, just forcing you to bait special 1s oftentimes can just lengthen out a fight even more with her. And, yeah, she also is immune to shocks, which... She's resistant to shocks, which can help her be a good option at stopping a Nimrod, because she can survive like a special 2 from Nimrod, which is really powerful and just forcing a fairly slow fight from Nimrod. So yeah, very, very powerful defender, definitely one of the absolute best, and she absolutely forces a specific counter. You're probably going to lose the round against her unless you get really, really lucky. The best counters to her do deal with her very, very easily. So that's the reason I'm kind of skeptical with putting SPX in this tier, because, the best counters to SPX, you've got your Surfers, you've got your Sunspots. They're going to completely destroy SPX, but she definitely has more good than bad for defense, and she can absolutely win you a lot of rounds. Now for Domino, she's kind of RNG based for most of her counters. The vast majority of counters are going to at least involve some RNG. To fighting her. And she doesn't need Sig 200. It's just really nice to have, because it just makes that chip damage so much more, especially in a higher health pool metas. That extra chip damage can really help. And yeah, for Domino, there are really only a handful of clean counters to Domino. You've got your Sunspot, you've got your Nimrod, you've got your Omega Sentinel, but that's about it as far as clean counters to Domino really go. So just having so few clean counters, she has a lot of options that can work fairly well against her, but that's just it. Only fairly well for the vast majority of her options. And if you have a strong enough attack deck, Domino is definitely going to win a lot of rounds for you. It's not going to be common when Domino is getting, like, a lopsided victory for you on defense. Like, she's not going to be forcing the opponent into, like, an 80-second fight or anything stupid like that. She's almost never going to do that. But she's very often going to give you at least a chance at winning a round, which is super powerful, and that's the most important thing for BG's defense, in my opinion. Just super duper powerful to be able to give you just a chance at victory, even if it's not going to be often lopsided victories. She definitely can put in work, and again, it really depends on how strong your attack deck is for whether this is going to be a very viable strategy. But when you get your attack deck to a really strong point, these defenders like Domino, and another one that I'm going to mention for this is Mephisto, where if you have a strong enough attack deck, and the vast majority of these fights just aren't going to be super clean or anything, these guys can win a whole fuck ton of rounds for you. And yeah, the next two we have are Herc and Hulkling. These guys have kind of similar ideas. They really are just about stalling the fight. You really want someone who's, gonna have some AR, or someone who's gonna be able to nullify the immortality for Hercules. And because of the Infuriate, it can just fail so many abilities, and that Infuriate failing abilities can really stretch out a fight, especially if you're using, like, CGR, for instance, against Hercules, which is just super powerful in terms of stretching out a fight, especially at Sig 200. I forgot to put in that Sig 200 tag for Hercules, but he absolutely needs Sig 200 as a defender, of course. Especially at Sig 200, it can just stall out a fight so long. And if you're in a meta like Power Snack specifically, where you can get extra power and Hercules is just going to throw even more specials, it can just be devastating in terms of lengthening out a fight. And again, there really are just so few really quick counters against Herc. Obviously, you have, like, Rinshra, Wiccan, and Hulkling that are... not Hulkling. Rinshra, Wiccan, and Tiger that are going to be these reliable, super quick fights against Herc, but it's not very common. And yeah. And Hulkling is practically the same scenario. Again, Hulkling is very easy to fight. But with his Indestructible, there are just so few quick counters to Hulkling. You really need a neutralized champion to quickly handle him. Or, something like Hood, of course, will handle him decently quickly. And, if someone has their Tigra, their Wiccan, their Rinshra, they're going to be able to handle Hulkling really easily. But these just are not super common Battleground attackers, which just makes Hulkling an absolute monster on defense. So, yeah, definitely one of the absolute strongest defenders right now. Now, with Nimrod, as we get into the tech class, it's kind of a similar situation to how the science class is, where you really just want to focus on countering the cosmic nukes specifically for this class, just because of how strong those cosmic nukes are and how often the best cosmic nukes are getting picked. Herc and CGR are often just insta-picks for a lot of people, same with Surfer. So being able to prevent as many of these as possible, or at least slow them down, is massive. So that's kind of what you want to focus on in terms of your tech defenders. And Nimrod does a really good job of this. He just slows down the vast majority of the cosmic nukes. There are definitely cosmic nukes that can definitely do well against him, like Herc and Surfer. But there are so few of them that can do very quick against him. And oftentimes, even if your opponent has one of these, the fight is at least going to be a lot slower than these champions would normally have in terms of fights, especially because of the cowardice and the power drain. And there is also Medusa, who's a very good option for Nimrod, but just because of how tanky Nimrod is, even with that Medusa, it's still gonna at least stretch out the fight a little bit. Like, it's definitely gonna be slower than it would be if it was like an OS or a Warlock, which is really nice. And that special lock can add a whole lot in terms of just slowing down that fight. Those extra few seconds can really make a big difference. Obviously, there are some absolutely crazy counters to Nimrod that just destroy him, though. Specifically, Torch and Mr. Negative, especially in the bigger health pools. For that, they're going to be so quick against him and can really destroy him, and Starkey as well. But, you know, it's fairly uncommon that you're going to be getting super quick fights against Nimrod. He's going to at least slow you down a little bit commonly, which is, you know, the goal of defense a lot of the time. And yeah, also, a lot of the nodes really benefit Nimrod, especially Power Snack. Just getting that extra power is pretty massive for him, especially with all the Energize and everything. So, yeah. And all the debuff nodes, like the steady build-up recently, where it reduces your ability accuracy with all the debuffs Nimrod is giving you, is pretty massive. So, yeah. Now, for Rintrah, this is a bit of an interesting one. I do think part of this, for why Rintrah is so dominant on BG's defense recently, is just because of how new he is and people haven't found many of the good counters. I found a few of the really good counters. Specifically Sunspot, Hitmonkey, and Torch I've had a lot of success with against Rintrah, but even then, the fights are fairly slower than you would normally expect from those three. And yeah, his really long L1 animation can help a lot, and forcing you to often throw heavies and not play super aggressively, because of his interaction with getting cornered, can oftentimes slow down a fight enough for you to win around the vast majority of the times. And yeah, Archangel will also destroy him, of course. But yeah, he does a really good job, and his health pool is just absolutely massive. I think he has one of the highest health pools in the entire game. So, you know, having that is massive, of course. And with his constant neutralize, he is a complete counter to all of the cosmic nukes, pretty much, with the exception of Herc. Herc can still do really well against Rintrah. Which is really nice, because a lot of the time with these Mystic Defenders, even though they're Mystics and they're meant to counter Cosmics, you still have a lot of Cosmics completely destroying some of these Mystic Defenders, which is silly, but it is what it is, you know. And yeah, he's a very, very powerful defender. We'll have to see how he ages as more people have him and as more people find counters, but I think he's going to stay up here. And now for Sassy. Sassy is a little bit of an interesting one. He is another one where he's not really all that hard to fight or all that hard to get a counter for, like a Domino and a Mephi, but oftentimes he can, regardless of that, just stretch out a fight long enough for you to win a round. You know, he's generally not going to be having many super painful fights against Sassy. But just like with Domino and Mephi, if your attack deck is strong enough, Sassy is going to win a fuck ton of rounds for you on BG's defense, because there are just so few really, really quick options against Sassy. There are definitely some, you know, fairly quick options. There's just not many very, very quick options. And especially if you're someone who's banning Torch and Archangel, he's one of the best defenders in BG's. So, yeah, highly recommend ranking Sassy up. I do believe he needs to be duped to get the regen and everything to help out quite a bit, but, you know, very strong BG's defender. And now for Mephi. During these low health pool metas, Mephi has been the absolute most successful defender for me, which is crazy because my Mephi is unduped. You know? And the dupe is where most of his defensive prowess comes from with the Incinerate aura and everything. But just being able to slow down the fight just that little bit off of his very long L1 animation and not wanting to bait special 2s against him, just like the thing with SPX, can slow down a fight a lot. And then he has the Immortality, which counters basically all of the nukes that are like, okay, I get this big special 2 and then I end the fight. Like your Mr. Negatives, like your Shang-Chi's, he really does a good job at preventing that, which is super powerful. And there are just so few options that can end him super quickly and super cleanly, especially if your Mephi is duped. oftentimes they're going to be taking at least a little bit of damage, and they're going to be going at least a little slow. And oftentimes, that's all you need to win a round. You know, he's never going to have lopsided victories. But if your attack is super strong, he's going to win a lot of rounds for you. So, yeah, highly recommend ranking him. If you've got a solid attack deck already, Mephi's going to be one of those defenders that can just clinch out a lot of victories for you. Even if your opponent gets a really strong draft and really good counters to Mephi, oftentimes you're still going to have at least a chance at winning that. Alright, so yeah, here we're going to continue for highly recommended defenders now. So, starting off with Kingpin. So the thing with Kingpin is he really, really wants the longer fights with the bigger HP, because as he gets more rage stacks, you're going to need to bait more and more specials with him. And he's another one with a slow special 1 animation that forces you to bait special 1s, because you really, really don't want to bait Kingpin special 2 unless you're using an answer like Hood, of course. And he counters the vast majority of the debuff nukes, which is really, really nice. All of the debuff reliant nukes tend to struggle against Kingpin, which is just fantastic. Of course, there are a whole fuck ton of great counters to Kingpin. So he's not one that's often going to win rounds, but just canceling out all of the debuff reliant nukes can be very, very powerful, of course. And with Moman, it's a very similar situation, but with Moman, he tends to be a bit quicker to fight just because you can bait special 2s, even though the special 2 and special 1 animations are both still very long. Just having to bait 1 special 2 instead of 2 special 1s obviously helps, and he has less power gain. But yeah, basically the same situation as Kingpin. He isn't too hard to fight. There are a lot of amazing counters to Moman, but canceling out all those debuff nukes can be pretty massive and can definitely win you rounds. It's not going to be often that he's winning you rounds, but he can definitely do it. So, yeah, now with Killmonger. The big thing with him on defense is actually his crit resist. The reverb is not too hard to play around, but having the crit resist and having the power gain from gaining debuffs means, you know, against a lot of the other crit resist champions, you just end up using champs with damage over time, but you can't really have that as your option against Killmonger most of the time, which really, really helps. And even a lot of Arbor Break champions are not all that quick against Killmonger, just because, again, the crit resist can just be such a massive difference in making a fight slow. You know, very, very strong defender. Again, there are so many good counters to Killmonger. He's not going to, you know, commonly win rounds, but a lot of the time, you may end up in a situation where, you know, Killmonger is being taken by, like, Hercules, or by, like, a Storm or something, you know, a non-ideal counter, and then you have a situation like a Domino, like a Sassy, like a Mephi, where if you've got a strong, attacker option, then he can definitely win you rounds. So, yeah. Next up, for the Science Champs, I-Bomb is the first one up here. The issue with I-Bomb is in these skill attackers that benefit from getting debuffs, he gets absolutely destroyed by them, by like Kingpin and Crossbones. And the other thing is, he's weak to a lot of the skill attackers. Shang-Chi and Hidden Monkey are two of the, you know, specific ones that really destroy him as well. So that's the big issue with him. But he does have a really long special 1 animation again, and with all of his physical resistance and having a massive health pool, he can definitely slow down a fight. But again, oftentimes he's kind of like Kingpin and Mole, where, you know, he's not going to be commonly winning rounds for you, but he absolutely can win rounds for you. If the opponent ends up with not having a great counter to him, he can absolutely end up winning rounds. And yeah, countering a lot of the common nukes just via needing someone who can deal with the poison debuffs in some way, whether that's by shrugging them, or by being immune, or by using a strategy like CGR where you just end the fight in so few hits, you know? But yeah, I mean, he's very strong on defense, of course, with this, but he's not going to be commonly winning rounds by any means. Now, next up, we've got Mr. Fantastic. And Mr. Fantastic is a really interesting one on defense, because there's nothing that really speaks out in Mr. Fantastic's kit that would make you think he would be all that troublesome. And he's not all that troublesome. The thing that happens with Mr. Fantastic is he just has so many different ways to slow down a fight. Between the weakness on special attacks, between the taunt that gives another weakness, between his physical and energy resistance that can, help a lot when you're not critting, and with the chance to evade, which just slows down the fight even more. There are just so many different ways for Mr. Fantastic to slow down a fight that oftentimes you're not going to get those perfect counters, because you gotta cover a lot of ground to get a perfect counter to Mr. Fantastic. It ends up causing a very slow fight oftentimes. There are the perfect counters. You've got your Hitmonkey, you've got your Shang-Chi, you've got your Mole Man that are going to completely destroy him, but oftentimes he is going to lead to a fairly slow fight, kind of like Maffy and Domino. Again, it's not commonly going to be a lopsided, although I have seen some lopsided Mr. Fantastic fights where he just completely destroyed the opponent's attacker with all these ways to slow it down, but, if you've got a strong attack deck, he will definitely win a lot of rounds for you. Alright. Now, I-Hulk, he is one that is really interesting to talk about. And now, he's mostly here for his interaction with Sui's, where if he has recoil, if he's throwing those specials, this will actually make it so he's gonna have a really good chance at going into immortality. And this can make it so a lot of even the best skill nukes won't be able to stop him from going to immortality, because the recoil just feeds his gamma charges, which is so massive for I-Hulk. It can just slow down a fight so much. It's a really stupid interaction that I hate it, but it's very powerful. So if you're running a recoil deck, he's an absolute must-have, of course. The only issue with I-Hulk on defense is there are just so many counters that are extremely good to him, because almost all of these skill nukes completely destroy him. You've got Hitmonkey, you've got Nick Fury, you've got Black Widow Deadly Origin, you've got Crossbones, you've got Falcon, you've got all of the damage over time skill nukes, all of the AAR skill nukes that are going to completely destroy him. And this is a pretty big deal, because again, the skill nukes are some of the most powerful BG champions. So feeding into the strengths of that, and then he also feeds into the strengths of some of the other most powerful champions in BG, specifically Herc and Surfer. With the red damage, they can also bypass the immortality. They do have to alter their playstyle a little bit to maximize the red damage, but they can also bypass that, which is really, really powerful, which makes him a lot less powerful, because again, just feeding into the best attackers is in general what you want to avoid. But with the recoil, he's definitely one of the must-haves. Without recoil, it's arguable whether or not you even should rank him for BGs, but there's definitely a lot of merit to him, but there is definitely a lot of downsides to him as well. So now Overseer, in these lower HP metas, Overseer has been pretty fucking weak on defense, because oftentimes you can just win fights before baiting a special, and this makes Overseer basically useless on defense. But yeah, in the longer fights, the way he can force you to have to deal with that auto block oftentimes can be pretty damn powerful. Again, he feeds into skill nukes, which is the big issue with him. He has the same issue as I-Hulk, where you just feed into so many of those skill nukes, and it definitely decreases his value on defense just massively. And then again, he feeds into CGR and Herc and Surfer, and that's the big issue with him. So it's hard to say whether or not he's really going to be worth ranking for defense, but he can definitely win rounds if you don't have an amazing counter to him. That's kind of what the science class is for defense in BGs. It's if they don't end up with a great counter, maybe you can squeeze out a win. But, these are not very strong defenders by any means. None of these are going to be insta-ranks for me. It's kind of going to depend, with the exception of if you have a recoil deck, absolutely rank I-Hulk, of course. And, yeah, next up for these mutant ones, first of all, with Bishop, he gets a whole lot from Sui's on defense, because the bleed debuff enters his overload, which, if you're not using a tech option, can do a lot of damage to you, and has the potential to force him to have an unblockable special, which can just make you lose a fight a lot of the time. So he's another one where, if you got a recoil deck, he's a must-have for me. But, yeah. And the really nice thing about Bishop on defense is he counters pretty much all of the skill nukes. With the exception of Shang-Chi, he counters almost all of these skill nukes, which is super duper powerful, because again, skill nukes are some of the most powerful champions in BGs. There are a lot of great counters to Bishop that will absolutely destroy him, especially Ghost. Ghost just obviously memes on him, but, you know, countering all those skill nukes can be pretty massive for you. And I would definitely recommend ranking him for BGs for that purpose of just countering the skill nukes. So Weapon X is a bit of an interesting one. A lot of the DOT champions, heal box champions, whatever, don't really have all that hard of a time with Weapon X. And he's definitely not an insta-rank 4 defense for me, but one of the big things is there aren't many people that are super comfortable with fighting Weapon X, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon, because he's not a super common defender almost ever. So this makes it so a lot of people are just uncomfortable with fighting him, and a lot of people don't know the best options outside of the obvious options for him. So that can definitely help. You know, there are a lot of amazing options for Weapon X. You've got your Warlocks, you've got your Nimrods and Omega Sentinels, Archangels and whatnot. There are a lot of very easy counters to Weapon X, of course. But a lot of people being uncomfortable with fighting him, and, you know, there being a fairly small amount of direct counters to Weapon X can often lead to a bunch of 1 rounds. And yeah. Now, Strife is another one similar to the Dominoes and Mephis and all this, where Strife is never going to give you a lopsided victory. But the thing with his glancing and everything is, you know, oftentimes it will give you a chance to win again. If you've got a strong attacking matchup going forward, Strife can definitely win you some rounds, because there are just so few amazing counters to them. There definitely are for Strife, though. There are definitely quite a few for Strife. But, you know, it's not a large amount, and his glancing can definitely help a lot with that, especially with the invisibility off the L1 and everything. He just has a lot of different ways to slow down the fight, especially if you've got a high sig Strife, but I wouldn't put the, you know, super needs 200 on him. You know, he can just have a lot of different ways to slow down the fight if you don't have a perfect counter to him, if you don't have that CGR or whatever. He can do quite a lot. And yeah, definitely a pretty powerful defender. I've had some mixed results with him, but, you know, he definitely has given me a chance to win quite a few rounds on defense, which has been nice. Now, Sauron is an interesting one. I'm actually not sure how this is going to develop in the future, and I think Sauron is one I'd be cautious with ranking for defense, because I do fully expect that Sauron may eventually ending up like another Kitty, where when people understand how to fight him and everything, we're going to find a whole lot of counters outside of the traditional ones, and then he's going to not get used very much on defense, but currently he can definitely do quite a lot to slow down a fight. With his regens, and, you know, with the wanting to bait special ones a lot again, which is massive, you know, because you really, really do want to bait special ones against Sauron to remove all those prowess, and with that, oftentimes can lead to slower fights, which is really nice. There are a whole lot of complete counters to him, though, you know, Warlock, Omega Sentinel, Nimrod, and then, of course, you have your Tigra, you have your Torch, you have your Omega Red that will also completely destroy him, and, of course, Cosmic Ghost Rider and Hercules and Surfer, and all of these just perfect counters. And he's one like that where there are a lot of perfect counters, and I expect there to be more and more that find out as, you know, more BG rounds happen and everything in the full game mode. But currently, he can definitely win some rounds. Now, Mags is going to be an interesting one, because it's very, very rare when Mags is actually going to win a round on defense for you. It's not something I would expect to commonly happen. but it can happen, and with Mags being a solid attacker as well, oftentimes he is worth drafting for the potential of it, because one of the nice things Mags does is he counters a lot of the skill nuke options, with being resistant to both shock and bleed. That covers a lot of ground, and that's definitely massive. And then of course he counters all of the metal options, so that is a lot of the best nukes covered by Mags. So if your opponent has a lot of those nukes drafted, and you get, Mags is like one of your last picks, he can definitely win some rounds for you. It's not going to be a common thing or anything, but it can definitely happen. And I've seen it happen a lot, and it's been pretty funny every time it's happened. But yeah. Now next up, moving into the cosmics, King Groot is an interesting one. The thing with King Groot is he generally counters a lot of the debuff reliant nukes. The thing that he doesn't do too well in the lower HP metas is oftentimes the first set of Furies is not all that many Furies. It's generally the second and third set of Furies that start really having a lot of debuffs you gotta get rid of. So oftentimes these debuff champs that are reliant on getting these debuffs can still destroy him in BGs with the lower HPs, because, they're just gonna end it before that second or third set of Furies starts happening. But in the bigger HPs, this is not so much a common possibility, and he can be very, very strong on defense in the bigger HP metas. But yeah, he gets destroyed by a lot of options, but, countering some of the debuff nukes, especially in the longer HP metas, can definitely do quite a lot of work. Definitely not a hard defender by any means. He's more just here for the ones that he stops. Now, Annihilus is a bit of an interesting one. One of the big things with Annihilus is oftentimes if his AI decides to be annoying when you have a non-standard counter to Annihilus, or even if you have one of the standard counters, but maybe it's one of the standard counters that is a little bit reliant on AI, let's say like your Tigra, your Mordo, or whatever, where you're abusing the buff specifically, or your Hood or whatever, when you don't get that Nullify immediately, he can definitely do a lot with his AI to slow down a fight. And it's another one where you actively want to bait special ones. And the big thing with baiting special ones from Annihilus is that you can't counter its L1 easily, which means, just like with Mags, it can definitely go quite a while in terms of slowing down a fight, which is really, really nice. He again has a lot of direct counters. Anyone with armor break, almost all of the mystics are going to destroy him and everything. But he's definitely going to win rounds for you. He has a lot of ways to just stall and slow down a fight. Now, Hyperion is an interesting one, because Hyperion doesn't really stop any of the nukes. All of the nukes can take Hyperion. A lot of times it just ends up being a little bit RNG based. And that's kind of what Hyperion is on defense for me. Kind of just a Hail Mary. He definitely does a lot better at being this Hail Mary with the higher health pools where it's harder to nuke him. But even in the lower HP metas, he can definitely cause you to lose rounds. I've had times with Sunspot or Torch where the only special that Hyperion is throwing is his special 3, and you just immediately lose a round because of that. One of the negatives is there's definitely a lot of Mystic counters to Hyperion that will completely destroy him, of course. You've got your Rintraws, you've got your Tigras, you've got your Wiccans, you've got your Hoods, all of this stuff that's going to completely destroy Hyperion. But the interesting thing that I've noticed is that oftentimes you don't actually want to draft a direct counter to Hyperion unless you just don't get other good options in that, or it's someone like Tigra or Rintraw that is an auto pick for you. So that's one of the interesting things where, I found myself and found a lot of other people just actively choosing to not pick a direct counter to Hyperion and instead just opt in for the RNG fight against Hype, which is definitely not a bad strategy, but it definitely gives your Hyperion a chance to win that round for you. And yeah, Terrace is an interesting one. The reason why Sui's tag is here is for two reasons. One, you're not going to be baiting many specials against Terrax, just due to his playstyle and everything, so having the recoil isn't a big deal. And 2, the Suis actually increase the rock field damage, which leads to you having to play a little bit more cautious when fighting T-Rex and significantly slowing it down and boosting the damage you take. So he's a lot stronger with Suis on defense than in normal situations. So again, if you've got a Suis deck, T-Rex is a must-have to be in there. And yeah, again, T-Rex, he's kind of like Mephi and Domino, where there's a lot of counters that can take T-Rex decently. But if you've got those really strong attack options, you've got a strong attack option to win that round, you can just place down your T-Rex, and a lot of the time, just like with Domino and Mephi, it's going to be able to win you rounds, which is really, really nice. And yeah, so let's get into the tech defenders for this tier. So first up with Penny. Penny is an interesting one on defense. The main thing that I've noticed recently in this last meta is a lot of the development of people finding new cosmic nukes, like Gamora, like Hulkling, has definitely lowered her value, and I think this is going to continue happening. With the release of Gallon, we're just getting more and more direct counters to Penny now. And then a lot of the cosmic nukes completely destroy Penny, especially Surfer and Hercules. And then Shang-Chi and Hitmonkey also, again, just completely destroy Penny. And that's the issue, is she has a lot of counters that can destroy her without the RNG fights. But she's one like Hyperion, where a lot of people tend to opt in for the RNG fight against Penny. You know, they take the Mole Man, they take the CGR, whatever, as their Penny counter, or the Tiger, or whatever like that, as their Penny counter, and they just opt in for the RNG fight against Penny, and that can definitely win you rounds, just like it does with Hype. The biggest issue with Penny on defense is she just has a tiny health pool. Her health pool is so small, and this means if you're using one of the good counters, the fight's going to be really, really quick, and that's the big issue with her. It's really just that tiny health pool leads to such a quick fight against her if you do have one of the perfect counters. And yeah, OS is actually similar to Penny in this way, where, you know, when you have one of the perfect counters against OS, she's going to be really, really quick, because she has just a absolutely tiny health pool, again, just like with Penny. And yeah. But the thing with OS is there tends to be a lot less of these perfect counters for OS. You know, you have your Hercules, you have your Surfer, you have your CGR, you have your Odin, you have your Medusa, and you have your Corvus. And past that, how good counters are to OS drops off significantly. And if you don't have a good counter against OS, a lot of the time it just means you lose the round. But again, with OS, just like with Rintra and so on, I expect a lot of this to wear off as OS becomes, you know, a more common champ, and people are finding the more offbeat counters to OS. I definitely expect her to become weaker on defense, especially OS, because of how tiny her health pool is. It means when you're using a good counter, that counter feels really, really, really strong against her with that low health pool. And you're gonna get some of the quickest fights you'll ever see when you're using those good counters. I think I took her with CGR once. I think it was an R4 Omega Sentinel, and it went down in 19 seconds with CGR with no suicides on. And I took another R4 OS with Surfer, and it took 23 seconds. So the really good counters to OS are just really, really good for her. So that's the issue with her on defense. But with how strong OS on attack, oftentimes it means you can draft her as a two-way, which is something that I don't often, you know, like doing, drafting champs specifically as two-ways rather than as a specific option or something. But she's one of those you can draft on it as a two-way. And if your opponent gets a perfect counter for her, cool, you'll use your Omega Sentinel for attack. And if your opponent does not get a perfect counter for her, cool, she will probably win a round on defense then. So that's the interesting thing with her. And the rest of these 4 tech defenders are significantly weaker. And these are the ones that I tend to be very skeptical with ranking. The issue with all of these is they feed into basically all of the cosmic nukes. And for certain ones, they feed into a lot of the nukes of other classes. These guys just feed into a lot of the best nukes. But again, when you don't get a good nuke option for these guys, all of them have some value. And to talk More specifically with this, for Guardian, he does a really good job at countering some of the DOT nukes. You know, he's one of the slower fights for Torch with his massive energy resistance Sig 200. He's one of the slower fights for a lot of nukes like Hit Monkey, like Blackwood of Deadly Origin, that are reliant on the bleed or shock debuffs. Or reliant on special attacks and then you don't have a counter to his auto block. Can do a lot, but again, there's just so many easy counters against Hit Monkey. I mean, against Guardian, not Hit Monkey. Mysterio is an interesting one because he delves really, really deep into this, you know, highs and lows with how he's going to do on defense, because the good counters to Mysterio, again, are going to completely demolish him, because when you're using a good counter, he basically does nothing on defense. You know, he can do a little bit of slowdown, but with him having a fairly low health pool and not having much in terms of defensive strength outside of his specials, oftentimes the good counters completely demolish him. And especially in the lower HP metas, it was very noticeable that you could just use basically any nuke against him and have a very easy time. This is definitely going to translate to an extent to the bigger HP metas as well. Obviously not as much as with the low HP, but, you know, he's not a particularly difficult defender. And he's definitely one that you really, really want at Sig 200, because even if they have, you know, a non-ideal counter, if it's a Sig 20 Mysterio, that won't end up mattering. But if it's a Sig 200 Mysterio, you can definitely heavily punish those non-ideal counters, and he can win you rounds off of that. It's just not a common thing that's going to happen very often. Now with Warlock, during the low HP meta, Warlock was absolutely horrible on defense. Because oftentimes, the fights would just be over before 20 infections was really happening. And when that happens, you know, Warlock is pretty much useless on defense, of course, before you get infections up and you don't get your offensive ability accuracy reduction, your power drain, all that stuff going. But when that can happen, he can definitely have some value on defense. Another big issue with him is he just feeds into basically all of the cosmic nukes and really does nothing against any of the cosmics, and that's the same thing with Sentinel. But these guys do counter a lot of the debuff over time, debuff nukes and all that damage over time, so that is one of the nice things. And especially if your opponent is reliant on constant abilities triggering, say like a Blackwood of Deadly Origin, when he gets up that infection, he can definitely do quite a bit to just stop those abilities from triggering and then slow down the fight considerably. And Sentinel, he's an interesting one. If he's throwing a special one, they're very slow and oftentimes force you to react in a specific way to his special tool, and to his special one, or you're gonna get analysis charges. And when he gets these analysis charges, he can really, really, really slow down a fight. And that's basically the only thing. If you don't get a direct counter to Sentinel, he's probably going to win a round for you on defense. But again, there are just so many good counters to him. He has the same problem as these other three I'm mentioning. There's just way too many good counters to him. So oftentimes, it's going to be very rare when he's actually winning rounds. So, yeah. Now for the Mystic Defenders here. First off, with Doom. Doom is a bit of an interesting one. The thing I found about Doom is he's one of the ones in the Mystic class that actually leans often into not using the science options. Which is definitely an interesting thing. So if you're going for the strat of using a bunch of Mystics and then, you know, banning science options, Doom probably won't be the strongest Mystic Defender in that scenario. But, he definitely does a good job of stopping a lot of the science options from being specifically quick. There are definitely a lot of counters to Doom, but his crit resist can definitely go a long way, and, you know, having it be harder to knock him down with the Aura of Hazareth off of his special one, if you end up baiting specials against him, can go a long way in terms of just slowing down a fight a little bit. And with the crit resistant armor, every little bit of just slowing down the fight adds up a lot. And he is one where you kind of have to choose between a risky playstyle with baiting his L2s and either taking that block damage or going for the dex and risk missing the dex, or baiting a ones and have to sort of fight. Now, the one thing about Doom is he's really, really weak to suicide decks. With Sui's decks, when you've got that Ghost, you've got that Omega, you've got that Shang-Chi with Sui's, he's going to be really, really weak to those decks. And in general, just weak to nuke decks, because of, other nukes in general, like, Hitmonkey, like Archangel, like Torch, all those nukes. He tends to be weak to. But, if you don't get a good counter to Doom, the crew resist, armor, and all the ways he has to slow down a fight can go a long way. Now, Man-Thing's an interesting one, because most of the best counters to Man-Thing are actually pretty offbeat counters to him that you wouldn't really expect. Tigra and Masakre have been, probably the two best Man-Thing counters we've really found. And a lot of people are not really good at maximizing Tigra or maximizing Masakre's damage, so maybe they won't have them in their deck, and then you'll be able to use him as a really strong attacker. And again, there's also Scorpion and Mr. Negative as two of his other best counters, and Omega Red. So with his 5 best counters being very heavily skill-based, if you're matching people that are not good with those 5 champions, he can do quite a lot on defense. And those champs are not exactly common champs for people to be very good at, especially Omega Red and Scorpion. You don't find very many good Omega Red and Scorpion players, so he can do quite a lot of work. And yeah, especially against when you come up with a non-ideal counter to Man-Thing, he is really, really slow, because your crits aren't going to do any extra damage. They're just going to be the same as normal base attacks and everything. And he is immune to bleed and everything, which can stop a lot of nukes again. So he's a very, very powerful defender. And now next up, Mangog is an interesting one. He is sort of like Doom on defense, with having that option of taking the slow fight, baiting L1s, and playing around the abilities and everything, or just taking the block damage off the L2. And oftentimes in BGs, it's better to just take the block damage off of the L2, of course. And yeah, Man-Thing doesn't really do a great job of stopping many nukes, which is the big weakness I have with Man-Thing on defense. He doesn't really do a great job of stopping options against him. He just is, in general, not that quick of a fight, and that often leads to him having potential to win rounds for you. Kind of like Mephi and Domino, it really depends how strong your attack deck is for whether or not you should include Mangog. If you've got a really strong attack deck, he can definitely win a lot of rounds for you. It's definitely not going to be as dominant as something like Mephi or Domino, but, he doesn't have many super quick counters or anything. He just also doesn't do a good job of really stopping anything or getting lopsided matches anytime. So, yeah. Now for Dragon Man. Dragon Man's a little bit of an interesting one. The issue with Dragon Man on defense is, again, he just doesn't do a great job of stopping many options to him. He just tends to be, in general, just a little bit slow, like this Mangog. And with Mystic the Surgeon 5, these just little slow options can really add up and do a lot. So having all that is really nice. And yeah, I mean, Dragon Man, he definitely has some nukes that he completely stops. He does really great against the cosmic nukes, because with the armor breaks, he actually punishes you for having the armor break. So against a lot of the mystics, you can kind of get away with using the cosmic nukes. Dragon Man is one of those that can just flatly punish that a lot of the time, which is really nice. And yeah, Dragon Man is definitely a solid one. The bleed and poison immunity again helps, of course. And just having that really, really long special one animation is really nice. The issue with Dragon Man that I've particularly found is almost every time your opponents are ending the fight at 100% health. Because his special one gives a debuff that just lets willpower healing do so much. So you have to be having a really good option if you're going to be placing Dragon Man, because your opponents are likely going to be ending that fight at 100% health. And they're not going to be super slow or anything. But if you've got a good attacking option, or if it's like a third round, and, your opponents have like a Mole Man or something as their last attackers left, where you can really use that bleed or poison debuff immunity to really help out a lot. he can definitely win rounds for you. Now, Ebony Maw is an interesting one. Ebony Maw, I found his negative physical resist and just in general not having many ways to slow down a fight has definitely been a deterrent to him doing very well in defense. But he does a really, really good job of stopping nukes. The guaranteed crit nukes, he just completely stops, of course. Ghost, Shang-Chi, Corvus especially. And that's the big thing with Maw. He goes a long way in terms of preventing a Sui's deck from completely destroying because of this counter to Ghost and Shang-Chi and Corvus and Gamora. And this can really help. He's not going to oftenly win rounds, but you really want him there as just a option to stop those guaranteed crit nukes and everything. And he does a pretty good job at stopping most of the cosmic nukes, with the exception of Hercules and CGR, which are two of the strongest cosmic nukes, but whatever. And yeah, if you're up against Sui's decks, Maw can definitely go a long way with stopping Shang-Chi and Ghost, which is just massive, because those two are so hard to stop against Sui's decks, because with Sui's, they're just so dominant. So having someone that can really stop them, that's really, really nice. And yeah, Mordo's a bit of an interesting one. He is, again, falling into that category, like Domino and Mephi, where he's just a little bit of a time staller, where he just maybe can win you around. The nice thing about Mordo is just how his AI interacts. When he gets that power gain buff and he goes so defensive, a lot of the time that defensive nature can just slow down a fight. Even if he isn't specifically slowing down a fight, just him acting defensively oftentimes can slow down a fight enough for you to win a round, which is really nice. If the AI decides to be a bitch, which it has been doing a lot recently, he's going to do a fairly slow fight, and if you've got a really strong attacking option going forward, he can definitely win you rounds again with that. He's definitely one that is very weak to a lot of the nukes, though. Like, Mordo is weak to almost all of the nukes, is the issue. But that AI interaction can just be very, very powerful and win rounds for you. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't highly recommend it, but he can definitely win rounds, especially with all the AI interactions, you know. Because that's one of the big things to keep in mind, is just how the AI is interacting. And when the AI is being a bitch, someone like Mordo is going to go far for you. And yeah, he's another one. He kind of falls into that hype category again, where people don't choose direct counters to Mordo, because you're not going to choose direct counter to Mordo. He's Mordo. And then this allows that AI stuff to happen and allow him to win rounds that way for you. Alrighty, we're back for talking about the defenders we're going to leave out now. So first up, with Jabari, there are two reasons why I think she's a pretty shit defender in Battlegrounds. First of all, her small health pool. This is pretty self-explanatory. She's going to be a quick kill, because she has a tiny health pool. Of course, she's going to be a quick kill. And two, as far as the skill purified champions go for countering this, you know, normally you'd think they counter the DOT champions, right? But with Jabari, the issue is she's not going to be shrugging enough debuffs to actually prevent the DOT champions from completely shredding her. Blackwood of Deadly Origin, Mole Man, Nick Fury, all of these champions are still going to be getting almost their full DOT effects, just because of how quick that cleanse is going to be wearing off. She's really not going to function great as a skill purify option for defense. And yeah. Now, next up for Misty. Misty is a bit of an interesting one. I've seen her giving people problems with this one. I know is exclusively because she's a new champion. The main thing Misty goes for defense is trying to punish you. She's not one that's going to ever take a long fight. She doesn't really counter any of the attackers you're using. You know, she has some purify, but not particularly strong, and she has some evade, but not strong enough that you really have to worry about it. Her main goal is just to try and punish you and hit you. But in BGs, with how short the fights are, she doesn't have much of a chance to really do this. She doesn't have much of a chance to really build up her evade chance and really punish you much at all. So she's going to be fairly weak on defense. And now with Kraven. The reason he's not going to be strong on defense is the debuffs that Kraven punishes are the non-damage over time debuffs. And in BGs, this isn't a big deal. It will make it a little bit slower for, like, CGR Herc and Surfer will trigger that stuff and all. But the main debuff stuff you want to worry about for your, defense champs that are like the skill purify options are the damage over time ones. And when he just does nothing against that, he's really not going to do much. And again, he's one that's primarily focused on just punishing you, and he doesn't really have anything to lengthen the fight. And Stealthy is in this similar situation where he is exclusively focused on punishing you, and he does not have much to lengthen the fight. All of these are, in my opinion, completely worthless defenders for Battlegrounds. So, yeah. Now, for Spider-Ham. The thing with Spider-Ham on defense is he is weak to every single skill nuke. Like, all of the skill nukes completely destroy him. Every single one of them. And this is a big problem. Normally, with his taunt, you would think there's some value in getting that weakness and the special damage weakness. He's kind of a weaker version of what Mr. Fantastic does. Just because Spam has a completely tiny health pool. So you take Mr. Fantastic of what he does with just having all these little methods to lengthen the fight, but then you put it on Spam, who has a tiny health pool, and he does almost nothing to actually end up lengthening the fight. If people aren't good at fighting Spam, of course, he may end up getting some 1 rounds for you, but anyone that understands Spam is going to have absolutely no issue with him. And, yeah. Now, next up with Kitty. The reason Kitty's generally difficult on defense is because she can get dangerous without a counter in longer fights. But the reason I specify longer fights is because without a counter, in these shorter fights, you're going to end her before she can even get to that 10 prowess mark and start going, unblockable and getting all that incinerates. So in BGs, this just isn't a thing that's going to happen. So then with her small health pool, you're going to have a champion who can't really punish you with a small health pool, and she doesn't have very many methods to slow down the fight. Of course, she has her phase that can slow down the fight a little bit, but it's definitely not enough to make up for her small health pool. So, yeah. Now, the thing with Cersei, she just gains too many buffs, so when you're using a Mystic one against her, she gets completely destroyed. And then, unlike a lot of these cosmic options, some of her best counters are actually outside of the Mystic class, and the big reason this is an issue is because not only are they outside of the Mystic class, but they're some of the best attackers in general. 3 of her absolute best counters being Hitmonkey, Sunspot, and CGR, that are all going to take her in sub-30 fights, about their normal fight speed. It's a little bit slower for CGR, but that's it. Are going to completely destroy her. And feeding into these general nukes, and then also feeding into the Mystic nukes, is a pretty big issue. It makes her pretty worthless on defense, in my opinion. She'll occasionally win some rounds when someone doesn't get a counter, but it's not going to be common that happens. And it's really only going to happen when people don't understand Cersei, or, they just get extremely unlucky to a point that it's just so unlikely to happen. And yeah, next up for Hulkbuster. This is pretty simple. He just feeds into too many of the skill and cosmic nukes. The skill and cosmic nukes, just the vast majority of them completely destroy him. And feeding into the skill and cosmic nukes is a big no-no. And he doesn't really have much to slow down the fight with his very quick special animations. And the armor debuffs not really mattering all that much for BGs in terms of actually slowing down the fight. Now, with Chavez. This one's an interesting one. The main reason Chavez is difficult on defense in general is because, 1, people were uncomfortable with fighting her for a while. Because you have to get pretty specific with her animations for avoiding dexing her L1 and making sure you avoid it, but you don't actually trigger the dex buff. And learning to counter the first hit of her heavy to get that orange debuff up. These are 2 mechanical things that people just weren't comfortable with for a pretty long time. But now that people are comfortable with that, she tends to not really be dangerous if you understand how to do that, and you can get away with using basically anyone for her. And the other thing is that she really relies on long fights. This is why you see her commonly just placed on boss island nodes, placed on, ebb and flow nodes, because she heavily relies on a fight getting long and getting out of control. Because if a fight gets out of control in a short fight, it's not going to get out of control to a point that actually matters. And PG's inherently being based around short fights with, 2 minutes maximum, and the bigger HPs, and oftentimes it's never going to take that long. She's pretty worthless on defense in BG's. If you have an opponent that knows what they're doing against Chavez, they're going to be able to stretch pretty much all of the nuke options to fight Chavez. She's just not going to do great. Obviously, she does stop a handful of the cosmic nukes, but that's about it. And yeah, now for specific node defenders. These are defenders that I think are, in general, pretty weak. But then, with a specific node, they have some value. Now, talking about these are not defenders I necessarily recommend ranking automatically, but these are defenders that can absolutely put in work with a specific node, and we're going to talk about these just because I want to mention some of the interactions here. We obviously haven't had all that many metas to really see a full landscape of how nodes are going to affect the defensive meta, but these are the ones that we have seen some of that impact with, so let's talk about them. So first up, with Scorpion, you really heavily get a lot of benefit from Power Stack, and you really heavily get a lot of benefit from the debuff node for now. These are the two ones, but this is a lot in large part because people aren't comfortable with fully dexing his L1 yet. When people get comfortable with that, he's going to be very weak on defense again, in my opinion. He does have the evade you need to watch out for, but the vast majority of the skill nukes are going to be able to deal with him very easily. But yeah, as far as people not being comfortable with him, I do think he's going to maintain some value for quite a bit on defense, because it's pretty hard mechanically to do, but people are definitely going to learn that skill eventually. I imagine 6 months' time, he will probably start slowly losing value as people really learn how to fight Scorpion, because a lot of it is just based on mechanical skill for fighting Scorpion. Now for Joe Fixit, he is an interesting one. Bubble Shield is the big note that's just made him a menace, because with that L1, if it goes through your block and bleeds you, that's it, you just die. But in general, Joe Fixit is not that strong on defense, because the main thing he goes for is doing chip damage to you through the disorients and all that. But in BGs, this isn't a big deal. One, because, it's not exactly common that he's going to be doing, a whole lot of chip damage to you. He's going to be doing some all the time, but it's never going to be a large amount. So this is the main issue. And then, most of the nukes completely destroy Joe Fixit. He feeds very heavily into the Cosmic and Skill class in terms of who's taking him. And, yeah. The one nice thing that Joe Fixit can occasionally do is he can just apply a weakness debuff sometimes, and that can definitely stretch out a fight. With that weakness debuff, I've actually lost a round because he just applied a weakness debuff to my Hitmonkey. And then the fight got stretched. Instead of being a 22-second fight, it ended up being a 26-second fight, and that was enough to lose a round. But in general, he's not going to be too strong on defense. And yeah. Now, for Havoc is a bit of a weird one in defense, because he's one of those ones that you would think counters a lot of the nukes, but in actuality, a lot of these nukes end up being the best option for Havoc, even the ones that are directly countered by Havoc, like Hitmonkey, for example, or Diablo, for example, with the energy debuffs and the bigger HP. These end up being some of the best counters to him, because Havoc is another one that really doesn't do much in shorter fights, because in shorter fights you tend to be able to control his plasma debuffs. But in the steady build-up unblockable nodes, he can be an absolute menace. And of course, during Power Snack, when he gets a lot more power, it becomes a little bit harder to control those plasma debuffs, and then he can be a little bit hard during that. But he's still not going to be particularly strong against them. He's just going to have a little bit of value on defense in those metas, and occasionally be able to win rounds. Now, Toad is an interesting one. I think most of the value Toad's had in defense so far is, again, from him being a new champ, and from people not really knowing how to fight him. Because in BGs, Toad has a pretty big weakness that he's not going to have in story content and stuff. Because in BGs, you can just get away with using these poison immune champions because the fight is not going to go long enough for Toad to actually punish the poison immunity, which is a pretty big weakness. It basically removes almost all of Toad's defensive value if you understand that and understand how to get away with that. But during specific metas, this Toad can definitely be a little bit harder to pull off. A steady build up unblockable Toad was actually really, really strong because when he gets this unblockable, it's really hard to prevent Toad from throwing L1s, and this is how you get away with using the non-poison immune, just random counters to him that don't really do much for the fight, is you bait L2s. So during steady build up unblockable, if he got unblockable by chance, then the fight's going to get either really long, or you're going to take a lot of damage, or maybe both, and that's going to be really, really annoying. And yeah, of course, Toad also counters a lot of the skill nukes, which is one of the nice things about him. He kind of directly counters the vast majority of the skill nukes. I mean, obviously, some of them can still end up taking him just because of how strong those skill nukes are, but he definitely does a pretty good job at limiting the skill nukes. But in general, he's going to be fairly weak because in VGs, the fights are just too quick for Toad to really shine on defense. No, he is another one that is mostly based around punishing you on defense. He doesn't really do anything to limit options. He's just one that wants to punish you on defense. And this tends to be pretty darn weak in VGs. But of course, during steady build-up unblockable, Null becomes very strong because he's constantly unblockable, and he reduces all of your defensive ability accuracy, and obviously that's very powerful. And it makes it a lot harder to fight Null specifically because you really want to bait his L1, and his L2 tends to be a little bit hard to deck, so a lot of the time you want to just block it and dex out at the end. But in steady build-up unblockable, this of course is not possible. And the other nice thing he has is he does have some resistance to bleed, which helps against like Nick Fury and Hitmonkey to just lengthen the fight a little bit. But in general, he tends to be pretty bad on defense unless it is the steady build-up unblockable node. Now, with G99, on defense, she really only felt powerful on defense during the safeguard node. Because a lot of the time her weakness was just so many nukes being able to destroy her. But in safeguard, having the poison and bleed immunity went a pretty long way with just preventing champions from working well. Because a lot of the safeguard best options were reliant on bleed and poison, and she definitely countered quite a bit of people's decks. So that was pretty helpful during safeguard meta. She caused some slow fights. Obviously, she still had a lot of amazing counters just because of how low her health pool is. You're gonna find a lot of, kind of offbeat counters to her that end up working really well with how low that health pool is. But yeah, during safeguard, she could definitely win you quite a few rounds. And yeah, P99 and War Machine, these are basically the same idea. During Bubble Shield, these guys are going to be able to get their unblockable specials and go through your block and everything, and that's going to really suck and do a lot of damage to you. And then War Machine does this during steady build-up unblockable with the debuffs on his L1, which is quite nice. It's pretty simple, that's just what they do. And yeah. Now with Mojo and Swidgel, these are two that were really only powerful during Power Stack. Because the main thing that Mojo and Swidgel do, rather than really, limiting of what you can use against, rather than really making them hard in general on defense, what these two do is limit the options you can use against them. But as far as limiting goes, they don't really do a particularly good job about it because it's pretty much just countering like Surfer and CGR, and that's about it. They don't really do a whole lot in terms of limiting, and they're both champs that are very, very quick to fight. The one thing that I will note is Mojo has a little bit of a long special one animation, which can cause it to occasionally get lengthened, but he's just vulnerable to too many nukes in general for me to think of him as a widely valuable defender, but yeah. So that's my thoughts on defenders and BGs. I definitely rambled on for quite a while. This video probably should have made this into 2 parts like the other videos, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed my thoughts on all these different BG's topics, and yeah, who knows, maybe if there's more want for BG's videos when the full game mode comes back, maybe I'll make some deck building videos for each meta and everything. Yeah, hope you guys enjoyed these videos. Definitely a lot of effort to put together, as you can probably tell by the video lengths.